It's really a mixed record, but I think, more broadly what it does is show how Australia does have considerable influence internationally and considerable respect as well that we can capitalise on.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hello and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute podcast which explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Glenn Connley, Senior Media Advisor here at the Australia Institute. For many Australians, it feels like the world is becoming a more dangerous place. We're seeing horrific bloodshed and destruction in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan. American democracy is in serious trouble in the second Trump administration. Nigel Farage and his far-right Reform Party are surging in the polls in the United Kingdom. And we're hearing ominous talk of concepts like defence readiness here in Australia. With chaos and violence seemingly all around the world, there's perhaps never been a more important time for Australian diplomacy.
Well, today Australia is bringing the world together to protect those who risk everything to save innocent lives.
We risk a world where dialogue and diplomacy are viewed as a dead end, rather than the vital road to understanding, where cooperation to meet new challenges facing humanity yields to old differences of race or faith or ethnicity.
We obviously have set Australia's foreign policy based on our interests and our values. And while everyone's entitled to their views, we will determine Australian foreign policy, not anyone else.
Anthony Albanese has been on one of his biggest international trips, two in fact, in the past week or two. He met with Pacific Island leaders in the Solomons. He spoke at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, formally recognising Palestine. He even took a 4-pack of tinnies over to his mate Sir Keir Starmer's place at 10 Downing Street. But was the trip a success? Joining me to talk about Australian diplomacy, Israel's war on Gaza and the US government's crackdown on dissent is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Let's start in the US and the Middle East. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have come up with a 20-point peace plan for Gaza. What does it include? What do you make of that?
Well, I think, Glenn, the first clue, I suppose, is in who announced this deal. As you pointed out, it was President Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. There were no Palestinian leaders present. There were no other Middle Eastern leaders present. And what that means is that the substance of the deal, of course, unsurprisingly, really favours Israel. So there are a number of points in it, including an immediate ceasefire, the return of hostages, prisoner exchange as well, and then some other provisions, I suppose, for longer-term peace. So President Trump himself is going to head up what they've described as an apolitical technocratic transition body, and we all know how great President Trump is at being apolitical. And they've also included the establishment of what they're describing as an international stabilisation force, which sounds like a peacekeeping mission. And indicators are that that would be provided or supplied by adjacent Middle Eastern Arab nations, again, nations that weren't consulted as part of this peace deal. And so really, I think unfortunately, as much as there are some important steps in this plan, potentially important steps, it seems doomed to fail, given the incredible lack of trust, given that key players in this conflict were not included, and probably most importantly, given the fact that Netanyahu effectively has a veto power over all of this. He can kill the whole thing if he wants to.
But if Hamas rejects your plan, Mr. President, or if they supposedly accept it and then basically do everything to counter it, then Israel will finish the job by itself.
Israel would have my full backing to finish the job of destroying the threat of Hamas, but I hope that we're going to have a deal for peace.
and, as Trump put it, quote unquote, finish the job if Hamas doesn't agree to this peace plan. And when we're talking in the context of what the UN has described, a UN report has described as a genocide, the idea of finishing the job is pretty terrifying.
This is the first of the plans or of the many discussions that certainly that I've read about that has much in the way of detail beyond what happens after a ceasefire or the end of the war. Is that significant? I mean, we had lots of negotiations about ceasefires and release of hostages, but are we going to go through phases now where we get a bunch of different plans before Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, or even the people of Palestine approve one?
I think it is significant, Glenn, that this is at least attempting to look beyond a ceasefire, and I think that has always been a desperate shortcoming of ceasefire agreements, is that inability to create a vision for the future. I think, though, the problem is that Trump's particular vision for the future is one of effective dystopia for the Palestinian people, where they have no agency, and, where Trump has visions of a kind of Trumpland, what he's described as the Riviera of the Middle East, none of which includes agency for the Palestinian people. This plan does importantly say that nobody will have to leave Gaza and people will have the right to leave and return. But again, given the veto that Netanyahu has over this, I think we can't really rely on that. So the vision, I think, as you rightly point out, is important. And I suspect that's at least partly why it has found support from leaders across the world, including Australia. But again, I think that vision is destined to fall over.
How significant, Emma, is what we saw with Netanyahu at the General Assembly, with a lot of delegates walking out when he got up to give his speech? It looks like Israel and the US are more isolated than ever. Does that make this easier or harder?
I think you're right, Glenn. I think Israel and the US are more isolated than ever. And I think we saw that even with Australia recognising Palestinian statehood with significant pushback from the Trump administration. That's a mark really of how isolated the US and Israel are. I think in the short term, it potentially does make things harder. Netanyahu is certainly using that, a sense of siege, I suppose, to his political advantage, is using it to double down. But really, I think the international community has no choice but to make Israel a pariah state in this sense. Our friend of the Australia Institute, Josh Bornstein, will often make the comparison between Israel and apartheid South Africa, where, apartheid South Africa also became a pariah state. And that was the critical part of the campaign to undo apartheid, to create democracy in South Africa. And so while that can create significant short-term danger, I think the international community has really no choice but to do that given the situation.
Should our enemies choose foolishly to challenge us, they will be crushed by the violence, precision, and ferocity of the War Department. In other words, to our enemies, FAFO. If necessary, our troops can translate that for you.
We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. These people don't have uniforms.
Can we look at the US now and a meeting that happened overnight when the US Secretary of Defense sort of called in all the top military brass? There was talk of Trump gathering the generals, if you like. Do we know what all that was about? Did it happen?
It did happen, yes. So Hegseth recalled something like 800 top military leaders back to Quantico and gave this kind of like TED Talk style speech to them, in which he said some pretty outrageous things about, that they'd become the Department of Woke and that there would be no more dudes in dresses and a series of other kind of gross and outrageous things. And he was followed up by an hour-long campaign-style speech by President Trump, which was unlike a lot of those campaign-style speeches because, of course, he was faced with a somewhat stony-faced audience of mostly men in uniform who were trained, not to react, not to engage in that kind of politics. And I guess, Glenn, it was one of those, we'll talk about this a little bit, the way that Trump is kind of hard to grapple with because he's simultaneously so ridiculous and so dangerous. And this was one of those situations, I think, where a lot of the coverage has ridiculed this as, this meeting could have been an email kind of situation. Why do you call back 800 leaders from across the world to give a TED talk? Like, why is that necessary? But it is also simultaneously really dangerous because there was a clear point to this. And, I think while it's early, it looks to me like really potentially a watershed moment, I think, for American democracy, because what Trump and Hegseth were signalling is the total removal of all morality from American defense forces and the American military, and simultaneously really turning the military into an instrument of the Oval Office against the American people. So one of the things that really stood out to me in Trump's speech was the way he said that, and he specifically identified Chicago and American cities could be used as training grounds for the American military. And so that's a kind of long way of saying that, what they are arguing is that morality is gone, that the US forces, the US military can do whatever it wants and there will be no consequences, and that it can do whatever it wants on the streets of American cities with no consequences, including retaliation. And that is a real step change in the role of the military in the United States. And I think it is probably one of the most worrying evolutions of Project 2025, which I've written a little bit about, which was the conservative plan, the far-right plan for a second Trump administration, because this is all in there, really having the president be able to use the military at his own personal directive. So this is, for me, really quite frightening because it is really normalising and legitimising that deep fascist tendency in American history that Trump has ridden to power.
So you think this is a rah-rah not for some external military action, God forbid Greenland or whatever it is. This is about what we're seeing in American cities, most recently, I think, Portland, with the National Guard sent out on the street. We also saw James Comey, the former FBI director under the second Obama administration, but of the first Trump administration, indicted. What does this say about the strength or the state of American democracy at this moment?
I would say it's difficult to be optimistic about American democracy at the moment, Glenn, given the things you've just mentioned, Trump going after his political enemies, like James Comey, executive orders coming out of the White House, describing people like James Comey as the radical left, that is going to be crushed by this administration as it is deploying the National Guard into the streets of Portland, as it is using the Supreme Court to potentially gut key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. I think we have to, it's really difficult, but zooming out and seeing all of those things in context as part of a carefully thought through plan, really, to dismantle American democracy, to dismantle constitutional protections, to go back to your earlier question, what Hegseth and Trump are suggesting is deeply unconstitutional. Using the American military against the American people is unconstitutional. And, clearly they don't care about that. But that has potentially severe consequences for American democracy, which, of course, as we've discussed before, has flow-on effects for the rest of the world. So it is a really grim picture. Nothing in that sense is inevitable, but the lack of concerted resistance to what is happening, the lack of resistance that we are seeing from the military, for example, to what Hegseth is attempting to do, I think doesn't bode well for the immediate future, at least, of American democracy.
Emma, what does it mean for Australia? Anthony Albanese finally found himself in the same room as Trump last week, albeit just for a quick photo, that horrendous photo with the bright white teeth.
It was so bad.
And obviously he's heading back over there in a couple of weeks. What's he stepping into? Is there any danger for Albanese plonking himself right in the middle of all this?
I think there's significant danger, Glenn, for the Australian Prime Minister. You know, imagine trying to manage that, getting ready for that meeting. Like, who would want to do that? I certainly don't envy them. When you're dealing with a president who is so unpredictable, you know, who, as we know, with meetings with other allies in the White House, has gone on white supremacist tirades, for example, with the South African leader, even using a PowerPoint slide, or attempting to humiliate Volodymyr Zelensky with the help of JD Vance. You know, that's a significant risk, really, for the Australian Prime Minister. That extreme version seems less likely, but it's certainly not impossible. You know, it depends on what kind of mood Trump is in when Albanese meets him. It depends, you know, what is happening domestically in the United States. It depends, you know, the government might have shut down. He might be dealing with a shutdown at the time. And the risk of the Australian leader, and by implication Australia, being kind of forced into complicity with what Trump is doing there, I think is significant, especially in the longer term, you know, as Trump keeps being Trump and almost certainly things deteriorate further in the United States. It seems to me there's significant political risk there for the Prime Minister that isn't offset by the potential gains of such a meeting, because, you know, there's a lot of talk, of course, about the AUKUS submarine deal and how this meeting might help to lock it down. And Trump may well say, you know, that it's all fine and he promises the submarines or whatever. But we know we can't rely on that. You know, he can change his mind half an hour after a meeting with somebody else. You know, Bridge Colby, who's doing the review of AUKUS, might walk into his office half an hour after Albanese leaves and everything might change. So the cost-benefit calculation for me just doesn't really stack up.
I had never thought about that angle of Prime Minister Albanese looking complicit in some way with whatever Trump is doing at the time. I'd sort of always imagined it could blow up over the PBS or AUKUS or Australia's position on Palestine. I presume Albanese is going to have to go away and prepare like he would for a debate almost, you know, go off into camp for a day.
I think so, you know, and prepare for how to emotionally manage such a volatile leader. He does have models to use. The French leader, Emmanuel Macron, is very, very good at it. You know, you can see how he almost physically manipulates Trump, like by sort of reaching out his hand or, you know, using his French charm, which Trump is very susceptible to. I don't know that Albanese is quite as charming as that.
Look, he's actually a warm, lovely guy. You know, he's not a guy you would immediately look to slap down or insult, given his age, maturity,
I don't think so.
Skills.
I think you're right, Glenn. You know, and I don't think Trump necessarily has reason to do that. But again, we don't know. You know, he and Albanese aren't exactly ideologically aligned, and sometimes Trump is fine with that, and at other times he is very much not fine with that. And, you know, if you mentioned pharmaceutical tariffs, if that comes up, that might be an issue. I thought it was really interesting that in the UK, when Albanese was there recently, he specifically mentioned the pharmaceutical benefit scheme as an achievement of Australian Labor, alongside the achievements of UK Labor. You know, I think that was quite deliberate. And so there might be sticking points there. I think they'll seek to avoid them, but you can't always do that with Trump. So I imagine there's a fair bit of practicing going on of how to diffuse a situation like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so if he walks into the room and there's something set up behind a curtain, it's like, hey, Tony, I just want to show you something. It's like, oh, my God. He's going to have to prepare for anything. Could we just go back to the UK? At the end of that trip, after meeting the King and the Prime Minister, he went up to Liverpool for the Labor conference.
A real inspiration to those of us on the left. My friend, the Prime Minister of Australia.
Tearing things down is easy, but it doesn't leave you with anything. The low politics of fear and resentment are easy, but they only divide the country. They don't advance it.
He didn't just cross a line. He flew to the other side of the world to give a partisan political speech.
It was criticised by Susan Lee, sort of who cares, and others. But speaking to a political conference, what did you make of that? That was an interesting step to take.
Yeah, I think, Glenn, this is a bit where, like, as an expert in international relations, I'm supposed to tell you that, you know, diplomacy should be above party politics. But I don't buy it. You know, I think we have this tendency in foreign policy and diplomacy to pretend that politics isn't part of what is happening. You know, and I don't know why a Labor Prime Minister would be seen as necessary for a Labor Prime Minister to pretend not to be a Labor Prime Minister. And certainly it's happened before. You know, we can go back to that time when then Prime Minister Scott Morrison went to an event in Utah with President Trump that effectively turned into a presidential or a campaign rally, you know, with hats and all. And he was criticised then. But, you know, at the time, I argued that, you know, this was Morrison showing that there is ideological alignment here. You know, this isn't just about diplomacy. This is about an ideological alignment, and that's important to understand. And I don't think this is any different. You know, I think the Prime Minister can prosecute the argument that it is in Australia's interests, for example, that Nigel Farage does not lead the United Kingdom. You know, why would a Labor Prime Minister pretend that they would be fine with, you know, somebody with policies like that being elected? And I thought Albanese's comments about defending democracy were an accurate reflection of Australian values, and we shouldn't shy away from that. So that's a long way of saying, you know, I don't have a problem with it, and I don't think that we should pretend that domestic politics and international politics aren't, you know, deeply connected.
Well, I mean, you make the point that typically foreign affairs used to be a bipartisan thing in Australia. So you had Susan Lee saying he'd stepped over a line talking to UK Labor, but the week before she'd come out and said, well, we won't recognise Palestine if in 3, 6, 9, whatever, never years they come to power, they would undo the recognition of Palestine. I mean, politics is changing constantly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, really, really quickly. And I think you're right to point out that hypocrisy and that double standard. And I do think, you know, that Albanese speech, the criticism is really out of proportion, because there's no indication that a Labor government couldn't work with a Tory government in the UK, for example. You know, it's working with the Trump administration at this very moment. It's trying desperately to. But, you know, ideological differences between nations are common, and we're used to grappling with them. And I think it's kind of silly to pretend that they don't exist.
Hey, what did you make of that YouGov poll that had Reform not just miles in front, but almost to the point where they'd form government on their own, and like 311 seats, Labor about 120, and, you know, the Tories in double figures. I know we're 4 years out, and that really does make a difference, particularly for that kind of a poll, but that's pretty scary, almost Trumpist type stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's a mark again of, you know, kind of how broken British politics is in that sense. You know, I think Albanese was there at that conference partly as a recognition of how much trouble UK Labor and Starmer is in. But I think that is, you know, perhaps this is unfair, but that is largely a reflection of the failure of Starmer's Labor government to address the structural issues affecting Britain. You know,
you mean immigration?
No, not particularly. I think that Farage
economic?
is very good. Yeah, I think Farage is very good at weaponising immigration as an issue, much as Trump, you know, it's following the Trump model that's been very successfully done in Australia in the past as well. But I think that's really a smokescreen for deep structural economic inequality that has absolutely nothing to do with immigration. That's just a convenient scapegoat. And again, UK Labor's failure to use its majority, to use an election victory to do what it promised, you know, and make people's lives better is reflected in that poll. And I think that's a risk that's reflected, not to the same degree, but it's a risk that's reflected here in Australia as well.
I must confess, I always, when an Australian leader is overseas, read the local coverage of his visit. And I did so, particularly with the UK, not the US end of this. And I always get the sense too that our political problems are never quite as bad as you think when you see them in the context of, say, the US or indeed the UK in this instance. Do you always get the same sense as well that it gives a different perspective to how good or bad things are here when you see our leader on the world stage like that?
Yeah, I think so, Glenn. I think that's a really interesting point. And reading the local coverage, I think, does really highlight that. You know, I think we are in Australia often, again, it's not inevitable, but we often are insulated, I think, from the worst of those political effects because of pretty significant differences in both our political cultures and our political structures. You know, I think Australian democracy is really more robust than American or British democracy because of our systems of voting and the way that our democracy is set up. So I think that's really important for us to acknowledge and to be proud of, really, because, you know, as you were saying, you know, on the scale of things, we're doing okay. Like, of course, there's a lot of work to still be done, but things could be a lot worse. And again, that's where that, I guess, connection between domestic politics and international politics comes into play, you know, that the collapse of American democracy does affect us, and we do have an interest in defending democracy, as the Prime Minister said.
I want to ask you about the last little bit of the Prime Minister's trip. He dropped into the UAE, where the subject was about inviting like an Emirati supermarket chain to maybe set up and create a third, maybe a fourth, if you consider Aldi, supermarket chain in Australia. What did you make of that?
Yeah, this kind of fell off the radar a little bit, Glenn, because so much else happened in the trip, but it was really interesting. So you're right, the Prime Minister, as part of the establishment of a free trade agreement between Australia and the UAE, has effectively invited this big supermarket chain called Lulu into Australia. It has a huge presence across the Middle East, something like 250 stores. And this seems like a part of a strategy to break that duopoly of Coles and Woolies. You mentioned Aldi, of course, but it's a smaller presence. This is potentially, I think, a nice example of, you know, how the establishment of effective, deep diplomatic relationships can, you know, have significant impacts on our local economy and how much those relationships matter. So I think, you know, the Australian government at least would regard this visit as a success, you know, with this free trade agreement, with the elevation of the relationship to what they call a strategic partnership, and some pretty successful meetings. So it'll be pretty interesting to see if we do get Lulu supermarkets. I think they're called hypermarkets, actually, because they're quite big into Australia. And it is, I guess, an indication of what successful diplomacy can do.
Can I bring it back to the Pacific as we look to wrap up? The Prime Minister went to PIF a couple of weeks ago before the big Northern Hemisphere trip. He went to Vanuatu, and I think he didn't get a deal over the line there. He went to Papua New Guinea, didn't get a deal over the line there. I know the footy season's over, but none from two is not very good in our own backyard, is it?
No, it's not doing in Adelaide and crashing out in straight sets, hey, in a straight set. Look, as our colleague Glenn Alan Beam told me on our other podcast after America, this was a pretty disastrous week. That was a pretty disastrous week for Australian diplomacy, in that those two deals did fall over at the last minute, which was pretty embarrassing, but also fairly consistent with Australia's diplomacy in the Pacific, precisely because our diplomacy, as we've just, spent 25 minutes discussing, does prioritise the US relationship above all else. It approaches the Pacific through that lens, through dealing with great powers like the United States, through seeing the region as purely a venue for what they describe as strategic competition with China, which means that Pacific leaders aren't met on their own terms. They're not really listened to, and so are presented with these security agreements by Australia. And then, the Australian government seems to be greatly surprised when they are fairly predictably rejected. So that big diplomatic trip that the Prime Minister went on, did get off to a pretty rocky start in that sense, but that's really entirely consistent with Australia's approach to the Pacific generally. And consistently, successive Australian governments, coalition governments, Labor governments go to the Pacific, present them with a security deal that's about, quote unquote, hard security and containing or constraining or whatever security word you want to use, China, great power in the region, when Pacific leaders have consistently told Australian governments that the greatest security threat to them, an existential security threat, is climate change. So we go and present them with these military policing agreements and then turn around and come home like this Labor government did and give final approval to Woodside's Northwest Shelf expansion, right? And Pacific leaders see that for what it is. And Australian governments consistently pretend that they can't see that and that, the domestic stuff isn't related to the international stuff. And this just highlights how much that isn't true and how much damage Australia's appalling climate policies are doing to our relationships with Pacific nations.
So let's sum up, Emma. It's not even, I think, November's summit season and the Prime Minister's heading off to meet Trump in 3 weeks. But looking back over the past couple of weeks, PIF, PNG, North America, the UK, the UAE, what's this past couple of weeks been like for Australian foreign policy, for Australian diplomacy, and indeed for the Australian leader and government?
Sure, Glenn. I mean, I think it's been a mixed couple of weeks. I was just describing how really unsuccessful Australian diplomacy was in the Pacific for very predictable reasons. And so I think that's really a reflection of Australia's role in the Pacific more broadly, and especially Australia's failure to really act on climate change. But then I think, certainly the Australian government would see Albanese's time in the US as largely a success. The Australian government took, for them, I think, quite a risk in recognising Palestinian statehood, and that, I think, they would argue went very successfully. It received considerable support at the United Nations. Australia was clearly aligned with like-minded countries there and survived pushback from the Trump administration. Albanese secured that selfie, which was clearly important to the Australian government and to the Australian mainstream media more broadly. And then he seemed, I think, to grow in confidence as the trip continued. I think that UK trip would widely be regarded as a success in that sense. And then, finishing off in the UAE, I think would be widely regarded as a success as well. So it's really a mixed record. But I think, more broadly, what it does is show how Australia does have considerable influence internationally and considerable respect as well that we can capitalise on. This was Australia, I think, potentially at least reshaping our role on the international stage to take on a bigger role and bigger responsibilities. And so in that sense, I think it's quite encouraging. Like, there's a lot of work to do, but it does show us at least what successful Australian diplomacy and peace building might look like.
Great, Emma. Thanks for following the money this week.
Pleasure. Thanks, Glenn.
If you want to hear from Emma each week, subscribe to the After America podcast. New episodes drop every Tuesday morning, or you can buy her essay of the same name from just $19.95. Find out more via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 1st of October. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPeak from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Glenn Connley. Thanks for listening.